Hi, thanks for joining. In this video, we'll explore custom ingestions. We'll build a simple custom ingestion notebook, set up a source, and we'll incorporate some parameters that are available to you in your notebook through the SDK. The custom ingestions are typically used to ingest data from locations that DataForge can't natively connect to. A common example would be some external APIs. So let's get started. If we're looking at our DataForge workspace on the sources page, the first thing that we want to do is open Databricks. And then within Databricks, we'll go to the Compute tab, and we're going to create a new cluster. So we'll click Create Compute. You're going to give it a name for the cluster. I'm going to stick with something more generic, like DataForge SDK. During development and testing, I am not working with big data, so I'm going to switch to just a single node to limit the compute. We'll update our access mode and then select a node type, which I like to use fleets. And then I'm going to reduce my termination to 60 minutes. So after 60 minutes of inactivity, Databricks will automatically terminate the cluster for me. And then if you're in an AWS environment, you'll want to select the instance profile that's set up. So we'll do that. And then lastly is you'll hit Create Compute. So this will take a few minutes to actually start up and start running. While we wait for that, we can keep working on other configurations. So we'll start with attaching the SDK jar to the libraries, which is required to be able to work with the SDK and run your notebook. So when we go to the Libraries tab, an easy way to find the SDK location, the jar location, excuse me, is go back to DataForge and then go to Documentation. And then within Documentation, you can search for the SDK. And we've got a custom notebook SDK article. And this is really going to be your guide for interacting with the SDK outside of this training. There are examples of each different type of custom process and examples of the notebook code that you would use. We'll get back to this later, but for now we're going to focus on how to set up the all-purpose cluster. So if we open this up, again, it'll give you instructions on everything I'm going to show you right now, but specifically what we're looking for is this jar file location. So we're going to copy this out, and then we'll go to our cluster again, and we'll hit Install New. We'll use the file path location and specifically the jar library type. So we can paste that file path in. And one thing to note is we have to update this file path to put in the version that you're actually running in DataForge. So an easy way to find that is to go back to DataForge, and on the main menu, if you look at the bottom, you'll see the version number that's running. So you can copy that out. And then once you correct the file path, you can install that library to the cluster. And as soon as the cluster is up and running, the first thing that it's going to do is try to install this jar. So we'll want to make sure that installs correctly so we don't hit any random errors. So one thing to note while we're kind of still in the early phases of setting this up is there's actually two different ways to run a custom ingestion into DataForge. The first being from Databricks, you can run it directly from your notebook. And then the second, which is more of for a production environment, you'll actually run it directly from the source in DataForge. And so you'll run it on a schedule, or you can do manual pulls. But while we're in development and testing, I like to actually get an all-purpose cluster up and running in Databricks so that we can kind of constantly on the fly test our custom process from the notebook rather than triggering from DataForge, waiting for the cluster to launch, and then seeing the results. So that's kind of what we're working on here. The next thing that we can do is actually go create the notebook. So we'll go to the workspace, and I'm going to create it in a shared folder here. So we go to create a notebook. And then what we're going to do first is just give it a name. You'll want to give it a name that makes sense, it's logical, it's easy to understand what you're doing with the notebook. But for this one, I'm just going to stick with something really simple as custom ingestion notebook. Okay, so now we've got our cluster starting up, we've got our notebook. What we want to do on the notebook is actually attach it to that cluster, which we can see is just coming online here. And once we've got the notebook created, we can actually do all of our kind of configuration in DataForge at this point. So the first thing that you're going to want to do is just copy and highlight, or highlight and copy the notebook path. And an easy way to do that is hover over the notebook name. You can highlight and copy that path there. And then let's go back to DataForge. And so what we can do is we can actually start with creating either the source or the cluster config. Either direction works. But I'll start with the source here. And specifically for this custom ingestion, we're going to pull a table within Databricks that's named nation. So what I'm going to do here is just give it a name for the source, and I'll just say custom ingestion nation. And then we'll give it a description. And then in the source settings, for the connection type, this is where you actually want to switch it to a custom ingestion. So you'll switch from table to custom. And then you'll see that there's two drop-downs now included, the connection and the cluster config for the custom ingest cluster config. This is the only required field, the cluster config, and it's so that every time DataForge actually triggers the job, it knows what type of cluster to start, where the notebook is that it should run. So we can create the cluster config by using this little icon here. That'll launch a new one, and we can give it a name. So I'll just keep it simple again and say custom notebook cluster, and we'll give it a description. And then for the remainder of the settings for the cluster config, so for cluster type, we'll leave it as job. And the important part here, right, is when we talked about how we trigger the notebook, when we trigger it from Databricks, we're running it on an all-purpose cluster. When we trigger it from DataForge, it's running on a job cluster, similar to every other process in DataForge. So we'll leave it as job. Again, I'm going to switch it to a single node, similar to what we did for the Databricks all-purpose compute. And then the last setting here that we need to worry about is switching the job task type to custom notebook, which will then allow us to fill out the notebook path. So again, we copied the notebook path, we'll paste it in here, and then save this config. So now that that's saved, we can go back to our source. We can refresh the cluster configs, and then we will be able to see our custom notebook cluster that's set up. So for development and testing purposes, I'm going to turn the schedule off until I know that the notebook is set up and working correctly. And then we'll save the source settings here. So now that we've got our source actually created, we do have a place that we can land the data. So now the next step is really just writing our custom notebook logic to pull the data that we want and send it to DataForge through the SDK. So if we switch back to our notebook, rearrange my tabs here. What we're going to do is we're actually going to create a cell in here that will import the SDK, run our logic, and then ultimately finish that custom ingestion. An easy way to get started, if you're not super familiar with the SDK, haven't built any of these before, is to go back to that documentation that we opened earlier. If you go to custom ingestion, we've actually got an example of what the notebook code will look like. So I'll copy that and paste it into our notebook over here. And so if we just take a look at each line, the first line, we're actually importing that SDK from DataForge. The second line, we're just importing the Spark data frame. The fourth line is really where we start to kick off the custom ingestion process. So what we do is we create a val, we give it a name. I like to stick with session. We set that equal to a new ingestion session, and this is specific to the DataForge SDK. And what this does is it actually tells DataForge when this notebook runs that it should start a new input, a new ingestion for whatever source is listed in here that lives inside of whichever project you're working in. So that's what this fourth line does. It starts up a new input, basically says create it and then let it wait. And then the majority of the logic will actually live in this next section, which is where you will define a function that returns a data frame. So you can see we define our ingest df, we set it to a data frame, and then within here we've got some simple sample logic to create a data frame with a list of numbers, and then we return that data frame at the end of the function. The last line in the notebook is basically what completes the new custom ingestion. So what we do again is we call session that we created earlier, and then we put .ingest, and that's really what triggers the SDK to run this function. So we list the function inside of the .ingest, and what the SDK does then is it goes through and basically ingests the resulting data frame that's returned from that function. So this is what then says goes back to that open ingestion that's currently running and says ingest the data and then finish the ingestion process and move on to the other process types like CDC enrichment. So what we're going to do in this example, again, this is a really basic example. Typically, you might have some more complex logic in your notebooks to pull from things like external APIs. But in this example, I'm going to keep it really simple. And what we're going to do is we'll actually create a data frame from an existing table in Databricks that is samples TPCH, the nation table specifically within that catalog and schema. So if we want to get started with that, I'm going to replace this existing logic from the sample code, and we will create a new data frame, and we're going to set this equal to spark.sql, and we're going to give a source query to basically create the data frame from. So this is going to be select star from samples.tpch.nation. So what happens here is it runs the SQL query, stores the results in this data frame, and then we're going to return that data frame in the function so that it gets ingested into DataForge. One more thing that I want to show you that is extremely powerful is you can also customize the logs that get printed within DataForge within the process logs. So for example, what we do again is we call session, and then we use the log function, and then we can give it any custom message that you want to include in here. So in this one, I'm going to keep it easy and just say my first custom ingestion. And now we've got a almost working notebook where we have our logic all defined in our function. We've got kind of our boilerplate code all set up. The last thing that we need to do is replace the source name and project name. And this is only required when you trigger the notebook from Databricks. So when you put this into production or you start pulling it from DataForge only, you can actually just wipe out these two parameters so that no matter what source you're running the notebook from, it's going to have that context for that source. But in this case, so like I said, since we're triggering it from DataForge during development, we're going to go grab the source name, and we'll replace that in here. And then we're going to grab the project name, which in my case is just called training. Okay, so now we're all ready to run this. So I'm going to run this cell. Oh, it looks like our library wasn't installed yet when we attached the cluster. So if you see this type of error message, the first thing you're going to check is that the cluster actually installed the library correctly. So if we go to libraries, we can see it's installed. So it was likely a timing issue when we attached it. So an easy way to fix that is if you open the compute and you just detach and reattach. And then we'll try to rerun our custom notebook here. So we can start seeing the SDK logs. And then we start seeing the process logs in here. And this is how we'll know that the ingestion has started. And so you can watch it from this direction, or you can open the source back up in DataForge, and we can see that new input was created. The custom ingestion just finished processing, and it's moved on to all the remaining process types. So if we check our logs really quick, we can look through basically all of what happened during that custom ingestion process, and specifically I can see my first custom ingestion log in here, which is great. So we know that the notebook worked entirely. So the next thing that we can do is we can start to parameterize this notebook. So now that we know that our custom logic is good within the function, we can start to use things like custom parameters to make this notebook more scalable and reusable across multiple sources. So right now it's very tied into, hey, we're just ingesting in this one source, and it's specific to just this source query. So what we're going to do is we'll go back to our source in DataForge, we'll go to settings, and we'll scroll down to the parameters and open the ingestion parameters. And you see this custom parameters setting here. It's a JSON formatted field, and what we're going to do is we're just going to keep it really simple, and we'll add a table name parameter. And specifically for this source, we want it to always pull from the nation table. So I'll save that custom parameter. And now that it's in the source settings and saved in DataForge, I can go back to my notebook, add a new line, and we'll add a new val where we can reference that table custom parameter. So I'm going to set the val equal to the same name. And then the way that you reference the custom parameters is within parentheses, you put session dot, and it's going to be custom parameters. And then we'll do a backslash, and then you'll actually give the name of the parameter that's saved in the source settings. So we're selecting from table name, and I want to save this as a string. So now I've got my new val that's going to be resulting in a string that says nation. So what I want to do is I'm actually going to parameterize the SQL query, and so we'll say table name in here. And now I can run this ingestion again. So if I run it again, everything should work completely fine, just like it did before. So we can see that. We see the new input. We saw the new ingestion go through. And what that's done by adding that parameter in is now I can reuse this notebook for multiple sources and just define a different custom parameter for each source. So that's kind of how you would use custom parameters. And you're not limited on the amount of parameters you can add in here, just following that same JSON format. The next type of parameter that I want to show you is the connection parameters. So we skipped over this when we first set up the source, but you'll see this connection drop down is blank. What we want to do is add a new connection, and we'll call this custom TPCH connection. We'll give it a description. And then for connection direction, we'll use source and custom connection type. And once you select those two settings, you'll see that there's a public connection parameters and a private connection parameters. So both fields are JSON formatted. The difference between these two is the public connection parameters are going to remain visible, and they can be used for anything. The private connection parameters are going to be hidden and marked sensitive. They get saved into Databricks secrets so that they're encrypted. So we're going to add another simple parameter here that's just going to be schema. And I'm going to say this will be TPCH. And then just one note on the private connection parameters. This is a good place to use to store things like passwords, tokens, any sensitive information that you need to use for your custom notebook. So when you're hitting an external API, maybe you're storing the token in here and then referencing it in your notebook. So once we've got these set up, we'll save this connection, and then we go back to our source, we refresh the connections, and now we'll be able to select that custom connection in our source settings, and we can save that change. And once that's saved in the source settings, similar to the custom parameters, we can go back to our notebook. We add a new line, and we'll call it schema. Actually, I'm just going to call it schema name. And then we'll reference it very similarly with the session dot, but this time we'll use connection parameters. And again, the backslash, and then we'll give it the name of the parameter. And then again, I want to save it as a string. And then similarly to before, we're just going to parameterize the schema name now. And so now this notebook is just a little bit more parameterized, where I can now use a connection on every source that I want to use this notebook on to define the schema. and I can use a custom parameter to define the table name. So if we run this now, okay, we see that the ingestion kicked off and it's running, and it's successfully completed in DataForge, which is great. Now what we can do is, if I was to kind of make this notebook more production ready, right? It's now kind of ready to use on multiple sources because we added those parameters. What I could actually do is create a new source, and we could say, you know, custom ingestion. What's a good table here? So if we look at our catalog, we could say part, for example. So we'll name this part. And we'll basically set up our source settings very similarly to the other source. The only difference being that now we don't have to repeat any of the logic. The only thing that we're actually going to do is we're going to change our custom parameter so that it says table name, and this time instead it's going to be part. And so then we'll save this. And the last thing before we kick off a new ingestion from DataForge is, like I mentioned earlier, now that I know that this notebook's working, all the parameters are set up correctly, I can actually remove my source name and my project name so that this is a little bit more generic, and we can kick this off from any source within DataForge. So now when I pull this data, it's going to run the same thing. It's going to start up that cluster that we talked about in the settings. It's going to look at the same notebook. The only difference is it's going to substitute my custom parameter. Instead of nation, we're going to pull the part table. So hopefully that gives you an idea of how you might use parameters to really productionalize a custom notebook. We're not going to wait for this to finish running. Just trust me that it will work. The last thing that I want to show you is in the notebooks. So you might have noticed that all of the code in here was in Scala, and so the DataForge SDK works with Scala alone, but that doesn't mean you're limited to only working with Scala in your notebooks. So for example, we could create a new notebook and actually work with multiple languages. So if I create a new notebook and I do custom ingestion with Python, and we'll actually just leave that, but we'll use the Databricks magic commands, make this cell Python, make the next cell Scala. And so what we'll actually do is we'll do the majority of the heavy lifting in whatever the other language is that you're comfortable writing in. So in this case, if we're using Python, we can say we want to set a data frame equal to the same spark.sql, samples.tpch.nation, and then we can make sure that we grab the right data that we wanted. Okay, so the data looks good. So then all we really have to do to pass the data frame between Python, and there's a Spark data frame by the way, but all we have to do is to pass the data frame is create a temp view. So what we're going to do is we'll call the data frame and we'll do create or replace temp view, and we'll give that temp view a name. So I'm going to say nation data, and we'll run this one more time, just make sure there's no issue. I'm going to replace the double quotes with single quotes here. Run it, and then what we're going to do is we'll copy from the other notebook the majority of the code. So we go to workspace, we go back to our original notebook and copy all of this again, just as an example. We're going to add our source name and project name back, just because this is the first time I'm working with it. So it's going to be custom ingestion nation, and then my project was training. And we're going to simplify this logic even further. So like I said, you're doing the heavy lifting in whatever language you're comfortable in. You create that temp view, and then all we're doing within the data frame function is calling that temp view. So we'll say valdf equals spark.table, and we're going to call that nation data table. And so now if we run this, it should create a new ingestion in the nation source, which we can now see It's actually already passed custom ingestion. But that gives you an idea of how you might work with multiple languages and still send the data through a data frame into the DataForge SDK in Scala. Thank you so much for watching. If you have any feedback or questions on the training, please reach out. We appreciate it.